Indeed, it is a privilege and an honor to deliver the 6th annual C. Shelby Rooks Lecture. I will never forget my experience of meeting the Reverend Dr. Shelby Rooks in Atlanta, Georgia in 1972. In January of 1972, I had just celebrated my 22nd birthday, completed my first semester as a seminarian at the Interdenominational Theological Center, and I was invited to an interview for a Rockefeller Scholarship with Dr. James H. Cone, Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, and Dr. C. Shelby Rooks. I was feeling good about the interview conversation because as a young whippersnapper, I was running on all cylinders. Every question they posed, I knocked it out the ballpark. And then came that final question from Shelby Rooks, the creator of the traumatic brain freeze. Dr. Rooks asked me the following: Katie, do you think women in seminary who will be ordained as clergy will be more just, more caring, better preachers, and more effective leaders than men? Even as a young whippersnapper, I knew 40 years ago that the answer was no. Women in ministry are not more just, more caring, better preachers, or more effective leaders than men. So his follow-up question was, well, Katie, what unique, distinct gifts do women bring to ordained ministry? Without missing a beat, I answered, the unique, distinct gifts women bring to ordained ministry is women's intuition. Dr. Rooks didn't miss a beat either. And what is women's intuition? Dearly beloved, I must tell you I will be forever grateful to the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays because my brain froze. For the life of me, I could not pull up any idea pertinent to intuition regarding gut feelings, perceptive discernment, or embodied reasoning. So Dr. Mays answered the final question. What is women's intuition on my behalf? Wow. Benjamin Mays turned to Shelby Rooks and said, Shelby, you're married. You know what women's intuition is. A heady breath of fresh air, and later that week I received word that I had passed the interview. I would receive the Rockefeller Scholarship to continue my studies in theological education. To this day, I'm grateful to the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. Therefore, the title for our lecture this evening, Revolutionaries in Zion, is based on an important book written and published in 1990 by the Reverend Dr. Charles Shelby Rooks, entitled Revolution in Zion, Reshaping African American Ministry. According to the Reverend Dr. Rooks, Revolution in Zion shares a common understanding of the concept of Zion in Christian circles, wherein Zion for Christians connect to the reference about Peter being the cornerstone of the church that is found in canonized scripture. More overly and specifically, his primary text, Rooks talks about Zion as a religious center where true believers gather in the African American church community to shift religious paradigms, to open intellectual doors, to knock down hegemonic barriers so that Black church folk can live, move, and have our being in the Holy of Holies. So when I talk about revolutionaries in Zion, the Gumption to challenge dominated forms of knowledge acquisition and religious power, I am connecting the prophetic mission and the emancipatory ministry of Shelby Rooks with those of us who benefited from the fruit of his labor, wherein he consistently confronted day in and day out one-sided, Eurocentric, elite male epistemologies of organized religion operating throughout the Academy of Theological Education. In other words, 40 years ago in the early 1970s, when the Reverend Dr. Shelby Rooks was offering his blood, sweat, and tears to make a night like tonight here possible, a reality, those of us who were mentored, encouraged, and financially supported with funds administered through the Rockefeller Foundation, we had no realistic picture. We had no orientation of what to expect. when we arrived at these accredited seminaries throughout the country. Our entry into these sacred halls of religious knowledge and power is what Nikki Giovanni calls landing in a landmarkless situation. Dropping anchor at a place and in a space where we see very little of anything that is familiar. Therefore, in order to get our bearings, we started searching for common ground. And what we found is that the oldest examples of dominated forms of knowledge acquisition in our lineage is situated in the wisdom literature of African monarchs, which extended over a period of about 3,000 years. These ancient African teachings, consisting largely of succinct proverbs and extended treatises, were a sort of encyclopedia of utilitarian knowledge. The original purpose of African epistemology was to train worthy male rulers and attendants of the royal household. The association between knowledge and royalty meant that pharaohs and kings educated their sons as their successors, while officers of the court trained their sons to act in ways befitting those who would serve nobility. These young men were expected to memorize and observe certain rules so that they would know how to behave with prudence in given situations. The main focus of this type of didactic instruction was to enable men by clever strategy to achieve status and to maintain power. Undergoing considerable changes, the royal origins of the African epistemological movement developed two strands of wisdom. One aspect of knowledge acquisition was the development of a philosophical system to define knowing with certainty, a type of artificial dogmatic teachings of truth finding for the male elite. In our contemporary language, this first aspect of traditional epistemology and African wisdom is categorized as the God's eye view, wherein religious scholars provide descriptive accounts of faith statements and religious beliefs that are supposedly objective, dispassionate, disembodied, mathematically calculated, culturally neutral, colorblind, and value-free. Now, the other strand of epistemological discourse evolved from an independent folk movement, wherein feeling with our brains and thinking with our hearts was understood as quite natural, as quite normal. This type of embodied mediated knowledge was born of basic observation, grounded in the everyday world of real lived experience, full of knowledge generated by spirit-guided intuitions. This primary task of this second type of epistemology is what my grandmother calls gumption. By this I mean that we embrace an epistemology grounded in gumption, wherein we critique what we know, how we know, the way we go about knowing, and what we do with the knowledge that we have. We're able to do what the great scholar Gerhard von Rad described as wresting some form of order out of the crude, chaotic ore of life. Wresting some form of order out of the crude, chaotic ore of life. Yes, this is the form of wrestling I'm talking about that's most relevant to what it means to have gumption so that we live as revolutionaries in Zion here in the second decade of the 21st century. Hence, I want to share with you this evening three stories. Three stories that exemplify what it means to possess enough gumption so that we can challenge dominated forms of knowledge acquisition and religious power. Story number one. Story number one is a narrative I heard years ago in the Black church community as I was growing up in Cabarrus County, North Carolina, and the story goes like this. There was once a renowned organ musician who was given a concert performance in one of the grand, magnificent music halls in North America. It was back in the days of pump organs. The concert was so splendidly breathtaking that when the musician concluded the first half of the concert, there was a 10-minute standing ovation. So as the maestro walked to his dressing room during the intermission, he was all besides himself, puffed up with pride and feeling real good about his accomplishments. So the maestro said to himself, I am wonderful. I am a creative genius. My concert is par excellence. About that time, the black man who had been working behind the scenes, the African-American brother who was laboring under the organ, sending air up through the pipe chambers, caught up with the maestro as he was strutting down the corridor. And the black man said to the white man, "Tonight we're doing a wonderful job. I think this is our best concert yet." The maestro spun around on his heels, angrily confronted the black man, saying, "What do you mean we? We had nothing to do with it. I am the accomplished musician. I'm the one who studied for more than 20 years in the great conservatories around the world. I'm the one who memorized all the notes and hit every key correctly. Didn't you hear that ovation? Well, that was for me and for me alone. You didn't have anything to do with it." The maestro then turned abruptly around, walked with his head erect, his nose in the air, leaving the African-American man alone in the hallway. Needless to say, in the second half of the concert, the crowd stood up and sent forth another long ovation, even before the maestro had time to take his seat at the organ. Eventually, when the maestro did sit down and touch the keys of the organ to resume the concert, there was no sound. The maestro tried again and again, and still no sound came forth from the organ. The audience was shocked. The maestro was embarrassed. He kept hitting the keys, but not one note of music chimed forth. Finally, it dawned on the maestro what had happened. The maestro called out his assistant, the black man who had been working behind the organ, even harder than the maestro was working out front. The maestro introduced the African-American brother to the audience and publicly apologized by saying, "Your standing ovation tells me you really like my music, but you would not hear a note of my music if it were not for this black man, my co-partner, who sends up the air." Well, the two men went back to their respectful places and finished the concert with even greater musicality. How short are our memories? How quickly do we forget? Where are the women in this story? Where are the children? Where are your ancestors, your foremothers and forefathers situated in this cautionary tale? With whom do you identify in this crisis of knowledge acquisition? Who are the people who pumped up air morning by morning so we could be present in this place for such a time as this? In other words, as revolutionaries in Zion, we need to acknowledge the creative ways the women, men, and children working behind the scene, pumping up air, know how to make sense of concrete yet constantly changing dynamics. It is our responsibility to tell our stories and to claim our interpretive authority. By refusing to send up air through the pipe chambers, the non-participatory action of the character in this story exposes institutionalized systems of oppression. In turn, as liberation theologians, we translate this type of transformative praxis as resistance epistemology, because it enables us to see with new eyes and to hear with new ears what our sisters and brothers who are forced into invisibility are no longer invisible, and those who are designated as voiceless can tell their own stories. Story number two. Story number two takes place on a bright morning in the spring of the year 1772, when a young African woman named by the name of Philis Wheatley walked into the Boston courthouse to undergo an oral examination, surely one of the hardest oral exams on record. This test, this ordeal, this procedure was organized so as to assess whether or not it was natural for a black woman to learn to read and to write. Do black women and men have the capacity to reason? Can we publish scholarly literature? The bottom line fundamental question was, how could a black woman who was limited to doing kitchen table ethics obtain knowledge commensurate to a classical education only available to young white men of Harvard? The answers to these questions would determine the direction of the life and work of not only Philis Wheatley, but also serve as a common denominator of black humankind. Perhaps Philis Wheatley was shocked upon entering the courtroom. There, gathered in a semicircle, sat 18 of Boston's most notable citizens. Among them was the Reverend Charles Chauncey, pastor of the 10th Congregational Church, John Irvin, a prominent Boston merchant, and John Hancock, who would later gain fame for his signature on the Declaration of Independence. At the center of the circle sat His Excellency, Thomas Hutchinson, governor of the colony, with Andrew Oliver, his lieutenant governor, close by his side. Why had this dignified group of Bostonians been assembled? Why had these men seen fit to summon this young black woman who was scarcely 18 years old before them? This group that later defined itself as the most respectable characters of Boston had assembled to question closely Philis Wheatley's book, the first book written and published by a black woman in America. We can only speculate on the nature of the questions posed to the young writer. Perhaps ask Philis Wheatley to identify and to explain for all to hear exactly who were the Greek gods and the Latin scholars she alluded to frequently in her writings. Perhaps ask her to conjugate a verb in Latin, or even to translate randomly selected passages from the Latin translation of the Bible. Or perhaps these gentlemen asked Wheatley to recite from memory key passages from the text of John Milton and Alexander Pope. We do not know the details of the questions. We do know, however, that Philis Wheatley's responses were more than sufficient to prompt this blue ribbon jury of Boston's finest to compose, to sign, and to publish an open letter to the public, declaring that based on the results of the oral examination of Philis Wheatley, that black women can think. That black women do have the capacity to reason. That black women can write and publish scholarly literature. So dearly beloved, the second lesson pertinent to revolutionaries in Zion deal with the fact that both in the life of our churches and in our seminaries, we too, like Philis Wheatley, must wrestle with powers and principalities. What Apostle Paul summed up as dealing with spiritual wickedness in high places. What I'm saying here is that revolutionaries in Zion must cultivate critical sensibilities so that we can ferret out our religious teachings embedded in the epistemological traditions that we inherited from our ancestors. Before womanist scholars entered the Academy of Religion, the prevailing interpretation of Philis Wheatley's writings from a theological perspective was always classified as otherworldly. Supposedly, Wheatley served a God who numbed her mind to the harsh realities of slavery in the USA. Prior to the 1980s, commentators tended to dismiss Philis Wheatley's religious views and trivialize her faith as nothing more than pie in the sky when we die in the sweet by and by. But here in the 21st century, when we look again at Philis Wheatley's writings as revolutionary scholars in Zion, we reevaluate Wheatley's religious matrix as being more than just some type of warped Christianity. Those among us who possess the gumption to challenge dominated forms of knowledge acquisition, we find Philis Wheatley's writings packed full of epistemological directives. Her poems and her letters give us more than ample evidence that Philis Wheatley understood that the Bible possessed high authority. Wheatley contends that we know the truth of God's grace. We know the truth of God's love and God's endless treasure of divine mercy because the Bible tells us so. So even though Philis Wheatley does not give us gripping descriptions of multi-layered misery and hard-hitting contradictions embedded in the Black American experience of enslavement, but Philis Wheatley does acknowledge the joys and sorrows. She acknowledges the ups and downs, the gains and losses of women, men, and children searching for meaning in an unjust world. Moreover, the Nobel Prize writer Toni Morrison addresses our inherited epistemology in this way. She says, if we want to study sacred resources that challenge dominated forms of knowledge acquisition, we must, where else will we go but to the writings, to our literature, to find the information? Where else will we go to find out how to hang on to what is important and how to give up the things that are not? Morrison continues on to say, in order to write soulful literature, one must engage in a mysterious process wherein we become conduits, channels, and mediators of religious power. It's not about being in the light, it's being in the right place when the light shows up. To make this point another way is to say we do not want our education to be unbalanced and incomplete or distorted. A key aspect of our epistemological development requires revolutionaries in Zion to have a disciplined devotional life so that we can actualize what Morrison is saying. so that we will not be in the light, but we'll be in the right place when the light shows up. Now, the third and final story I want to share with you this evening is my story. Some years ago, I was physically assaulted by a man I didn't know as I walked down the corridor of a hotel in New York City on my way to a meeting of Presbyterian women of color. Back in those days, I often wore my clergy collar, what we used to call the backward collar, when I attended ecclesiastical gatherings. Distinctly, I remember on this particular morning, I caught the number 1 IRT train from 116th Street and Broadway down to 42nd Street in New York City, shuttled over to the Grand Central Station, moving as fast as I could, putting one foot in front of the other, and arrived at the appointed meeting place on time. However, I was caught off guard, completely taken aback, when a white man in a hotel service worker's uniform walked towards me. The man looked at my clergy collar, and in one fell swoop, he grabbed me by the shoulders, and he slammed me into the wall. He said, "How dare you defy Jesus Christ?" I was startled. I was shocked. I was discombobulated. But I didn't say one mumbling word about the body slam incident that happened in the hallway when I entered the meeting room of the women of color. I simply kept pace with the order of the day, because part of my survival strategy as a womanist revolutionary in Zion is that I knew I had to keep on keeping on. Well, several years passed, and an African-American woman from the Wall Street Journal interviewed me for an article that she was writing about clergy women. When asked if I had encountered any hardships, any outright vicious, vindictive, violent experience as a woman minister, for the first time I decided I'd share the story about the white man in a hotel service worker's uniform who saw my clergy collar, walked over, grabbed me by the shoulder, slammed into the wall, screaming, "How dare you defy Jesus Christ?" The newspaper reporter drafted the story, and a few days later, the sister reporter called back to check the facts. The reporter's voice was filled with perplexed hesitation. I sensed that this reporter was locked inside of some kind of precarious, soul-searching quandary because the hotel where the incident took place no longer existed. And according to her fact-checking, the truth of my story never happened. The reporter's boss told her that my story was no longer plausible because there was no evidence in recent memory that that hotel near Grand Central Station ever existed. I detested wholeheartedly. And in my struggle to regain unequivocal, unmistakable, indisputable evidence for my story, I made the case that just because the hotel had been torn down, demolished, scattered to the wind, that did not mean my truth was a lie. I encouraged the sister reporter to go to the Manhattan Court of Law, to the Office of Record and Deeds, to get the necessary signed, sealed, and delivered proof of property, to retrieve the rigorous empirical documentation that a particular hotel existed right near Grand Central Station at such a place during a particular time in history. The bottom line fundamental point is this: it is as if this true story never happened. As revolutionaries in Zion, what do we do when we're told that our truth is a lie? What is our role in institutions of higher learning when the dailiness of our authentic experience cannot be proven by scientific methodologies? What do we do when the veracity of our realities with which we grapple are classified as questionable? As episodic soap operas flowing into the epistemological sea of forgetfulness. And many of us here this evening could probably go on and on naming exact time and exact places where the truth of our lives appeared stranger than fiction. Others of us could probably name numerous people, places, and experiences wherein we were repeatedly unheard but not unvoiced, where we're repeatedly unseen but we're not invisible. Again, for instance, one of the golden boys in the Society of Christian Ethics put the word out that my scholarship was mediocre because there was no evidence in the publications that I know anything about white men. Because I did not cite him nor his buddies in my footnotes. I in turn sent word back to the golden boy that no one earns a PhD in the Western Hemisphere without knowing a whole lot about white men, whether you want to or not. mean there are men and women walking among us throughout the academies, the churches, and the society who check footnotes, endnotes, index, bibliography, and the publication of scholars of color to see if their names are mentioned. And if they and their peers are not cited in our books and journal articles, then these supremacist power brokers dictate dominated knowledge acquisition, use the tyranny of abstract rationalism to devalue womanist modes of cognition, demanding that our canon of discourse be ignored. Yes, a careful, faithful reading of the historical milieu discloses that far too many of our professional colleagues who are defenders of androcentric, heteropatriarchal, male-stream, white supremacist culture experience our very presence here and at work as a cruel joke. The fragility of some church bureaucrats and theological power brokers, especially if they've been indoctrinated all their lives to believe that people of color in general, and women in particular, are insufficiently intelligent, that our mere presence walking down the hall, sitting in the same classroom, offering critical comments at the faculty meeting, these folk feel that their cultural homogeneity threatened. And in turn, they assess all that we say and do as nothing more than dumbing down and diluting the very essence of academic rigor. Dr. James Cone, the preeminent leading exponent of Black theology since the 1960s, says the following questions we must ask if we're serious about being revolutionaries in Zion. We need to ask, and I quote, in our work, are we articulating liberating experiences of faith? A faith that enables people to love themselves. A faith that empowers people to endure terrible hardships. A faith that equips people to understand pain without losing their sanity in the struggle to be free. How do we teach and preach a theology that encourages women, men, and children to struggle for liberating change? How do we, as scholars of religion, construct the theology that empowers people to survive? All I'm saying here is this. The epistemological gumption that my grandma Rosie talked about says that we need to challenge dominated forms of knowledge acquisition and religious power so that we don't get banished to the periphery of the church, nor to the periphery of society. Nor should our work be situated on the bottom rung of the hierarchical order of prioritized knowledge. Instead, as revolutionaries in Zion, we beg the micro question, who is God? And the macro question, how is God acting in the social fabric of our lives, morning by morning and day by day? I thank you.
So I'm going to ask if you have a question, if you'll line up across this wall and then come to this mic, pose your question so that everyone can hear you and we can capture it on the video. We're only going to be here for about 15 minutes. Please come.
We do what we call high impact aerobic ethics.
Thank you, Kate. I was live tweeting Dr. Cannon's address, and I tweeted about dominating knowledge. And I got a tweet back. Somebody said, "Are you talking about the vice presidential debate?"
And you said,
"Yeah."
as Toni Morrison said, even when they lie, they lie. I learned since I've been here, Susan, this way she was telling me, what is it, post-truth?
Post-truth.
Post-truth. Even when they lie, they lie. Questions, comments? so pleased to meet Dr. Shelby Rooks' son, and never met you before. So, so you were always said about your father, you could add your own stories as well.
Oh, definitely.
It's good to see you as you come before my star student, Dr. Allison P. Geist Johnson. I haven't seen her in a while.
Doctor, I would just like to thank you for your candor. I would like to thank you for what you offered to my heart this evening.
Tell me your name, please.
My name is Tandria Hardy. I am Minister Tandria Hardy. I'm with the Mission of Faith Baptist Church. My pastor is Reverend Gregory Sylvester. And in a room where we are clearly multi-ethnic, you told a very black truth. I thank you so much for that. May I have a hug?
Y'all gonna make me want to move to Chicago.
Hello, my name is Minister Karen Atkins from Third Baptist Church of Chicago, Reverend Dr. Alan B. Ragland, and Assistant Pastor with Dr. Lee H. Butler. Also, I attend the Scoop Nurturing the Call program. And one of my questions for you, as a Black woman, in your ministry work, I realized that there have been a lot of obstacles, but has the obstacle of your Black male peers been one that has caused you some grief?
One of the advantages of being a front runner, meaning that in 1971 when I went to seminary, 1/3 of the men in seminary with me had been board preachers. They've been told since they were 4 and 5 they were going to be preachers. The other 1/3 of men in seminary with me had just come back from the Vietnam War. And the last 1/3 were in seminary to keep from going to the Vietnam War. Because back then you could get exempt. And so here we were as single women, 21, 22 years old in seminary, and they wanted to know, why are you here? We said we were here to get theology. And they said, are you here to get husbands? I said, y'all must think a lot of yourselves. But the joy of being in seminary with that constituency of young brothers, we were also the first generation in terms of the social class strata of those of us at ITC at that time. First generation to go to college, first generation to get masters. And so we had a lot of support behind us. And we became like soldiers in foxholes. We really supported each other. I had never seen men weep like they wept. And so the kind of backlash I've seen since then was not my experience in the 71 to 74. But it doesn't mean it's, as I was saying, as I was talking earlier in the interview, that people thought we were going to be a fly-by-night operation, that they didn't know you were coming, and you were coming, and you were coming, and you were coming, and you were coming. They thought after our group, we were going to be it would be the end of us. We'll just keep coming. And so the backlash, I think the vindictiveness, the violence, the put-downs, and then the most recent thing I've learned, lay women in the Black church who are saying to women in churches that do have clergy women that you're going to hell because you have a woman as a pastor. That's the most recent thing I've heard. And it's like, it used to be the women in the church who didn't want the clergy. Now women in churches, women and men who know we can do what we do, are catching flack from women in other churches. And that's a new twist. I'm still on the prayer altar on that one. I don't know. I mean, it's like, And people stopping people in the grocery store saying, your pastor's a woman? Saying, well, you going to hell. I was like, really? At the Philis Wheatley in the food house? I had to work on that, but I don't know. I mean, that's a new sucker punch. I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't prepared. And so this horizontal violence is what it's called.
Well, I am appreciative of you being a front runner and allowing me an opportunity to do what God's will is for my life. Thank you so much.
And I'm appreciative of all of you who just keep coming.
I feel bad asking a question because mine was similar to yours. I'm Reverend Amitri Terry from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm in the Baptist denomination, part of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated. How thirsty. I came to ask the same thing, just some encouraging words. You actually brought me to tears when you talked about how you were thrown up against the wall. And I just even remember being in an Ohio Baptist General Convention meeting as a youth pastor, having the most youth there, but a man that didn't have any youth there at all. He just kept saying, I need all my brother preachers to come up here. And a lot of people want me to leave, and they say, go to the Methodist churches or other churches that are preacher women friendly. And I'm like, that's a comfortable place. But I just want to stay in the Baptist church because I just believe, like Jarena Lee in the AME church, and you, that I can change stuff. So just some encouraging words, because the church I was a part of in Nashville, Tennessee, I was the second woman in the ordained and licensed in the 109 years of history. And then I was the first youth pastor at Lincoln Heights Missionary Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. But even then, I hate to say it like this, and we streaming live, but I don't care, it was the good old boys club. You know, stuff the other ministers and staff pastors can get away with, they point stuff out. So it's just, even this year's been hard. So what's an encouraging word to a young minister like me that's trying to change? And I know we got to keep our faith. I know the good Bible stuff. And I know the seminary, and I know all that. You know what I'm saying? All the cute stuff. But from your experience, what are some encouraging words? Because I'm not gonna lie, and I don't know, I ain't gonna speak for the rest of the women preachers in this room, but it's hard.
Well, when I was ordained in 1974, I had to do a lot of Women's Day services. And sometimes when I get to the church, they would have to sit on the first pew at that time we have to preach. And that's why those of us who are female and ordained, we've got to cultivate our homiletical skills. I mean, because every time I got up, I had to knock it out of the ballpark. And it was amazing when I get through preaching. Sometimes the male preacher would come back and re-preach my sermon. Or I'd be standing at the back shaking hands, and they would say, why are you in ministry? You have nice hands. Or why are you in ministry? You have shapely legs. I don't know, I was supposed to look like a troll or something. I didn't know what I was supposed to look like, you know, and it's like, but I knew I had to keep trying and keep doing because I knew all this were becoming. And when you are given to whom much is given, much is required. And so as you're doing, I mean, you just know there are little girls and little boys who need you. And so it's a call on your life, you have to keep doing it. Interesting, when I spoke, I was a lecturer at the Hamptons Ministers Conference in 2008. And it must have been close to 10,000 people there. And it's interesting, now in 2008, I was, 58 years old? And people act like I had just arrived. You know, I see people in the food line, they say, you somebody. It's like, I'm ready to retire. But I spoke at the ministers' conference. But the first question that was asked after the lecture, do you believe God can call women in ministry? I said, well, we're here. You know, so we're going to keep getting that. And now theologically, we know God doesn't make inferior people. God doesn't make junk. God doesn't make mistakes. And so I just use it. I use the Bible, theology, and my word of encouragement is you got to have a disciplined devotional life where you cultivate your God consciousness morning by morning and day by day. Whatever activity, whatever behavior that makes you closest to God, that's what you do. For some people it's gardening, for some people it's needlepoint, for some people it's cooking, some people it's holding children, taking care of the dead or the senior citizens or those who are handicapable. Whatever activity, that's what you develop. And nobody outside of us can tell us when we're most conscious of God. But that's what happens.
All right.
I think it was in 1994 when the American Academy of Religion met here in Chicago. It was the year before I came to CTS, actually. I heard you say that womanist theology was like a girl who had not yet had her period. It was about 10 years old at that point. So now womanist theology is about 27 years old, a young woman. Do you have an advice for us who are living in the academy at a different maturation point than in 1994?
One of the reasons I had to say that is that we realize, just like in the feminist movement, there's what we call the anti-feminists. People who get buku money to say what feminists are saying is not true. And at the time when I had to make that statement at the American Academy of Religion, there was starting to be black women who were dismissing black women and saying that we were not valid, there were some people who thought of us as mammies because we were taking black women seriously and saying we're going to start our theology with black women as our point of departure. Now that we've done, well, let me just tell for those of you who are not part of the American Academy of Religion, it was at the Palmer House Hotel. I was telling Dr. Snyder that when I checked in last night, that I did my first presentation at American Academy of Religion, and I fainted. I stood up to read my paper. We responded to Dr. Beverly Harrison's work on Our Right to Choose, and I was speaking on behalf of black women. When abortion was illegal, every 10 white women who aborted, one died. When abortion was illegal, every 10 Hispanic women who aborted, 3 died. But when abortion was illegal in this country, every 10 black women who aborted, 7 died. And people didn't talk about it. So I spoke up to talk about why black women have to have a right for bodily integrity, why we have to have safe abortion. Women are always going to terminate unwanted pregnancies. If you don't believe it, ask about the home remedies. Women, and so I got up to read the paper, and I looked out at the audience, and we were in a ballroom in the Palmer House Hotel, and I just went down to the ground. They went and got the hotel physician. They gave me smelling salt. They brought me to the first question they asked: "Are you pregnant?" And I answered, "I'm pregnant with possibilities. I gotta be." If I don't make this paper, a whole lot of black women are gonna get a chance to go to theological education. I gotta read this paper. So I got up to read the paper, and the people in the audience said, "Give us a few minutes. We just saw you die. You can't just come back." So I waited until they got themselves together. And then so we've come a long way. I don't faint anymore. I mean, I didn't faint tonight, but I was getting close to it. We're publishing more. More of us are getting jobs on faculty. But what we're trying to do now, I got a few dollars to do what we call squaring the womanist circle. How to take what we're doing to the community and to the church. And when we met several years ago for the American Academy of Religion, and we were talking about womanist pedagogy, somebody got up in the back of the room and said, "Well, when are y'all going to do this to the church?" And I said, "I don't think black women in the academy should have to connect to the church just yet, because we had 180 sessions going, Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and nobody was asking how they connect to the church. So why should we connect to the church? Well, Dr. Renita Weems and Dr. Kenneth Brown Douglas said, what is wrong with you? They called me up to their room and they gave me a come to Jesus meeting. Don't you ever say that again. So I tried not to, because I know how difficult it is when you are new to the academy and you're trying to prove that you can do it. And people still thinking we're a joke or that we're not serious, and so we have to jump more hurdles than other people who have a large range of freedom. And so then the next year we were in Boston at the American Academy of Religion. It was our first Sunday, and Dr. Cheryl Townsend joked that we had to have communion. I said, nobody else is having communion? They said, shut up and take communion. So I don't fight the church anymore. So I think that's where we are now. We're squaring the womanist circle. We're bridging the gown and town in that sense of saying, we've now established ourselves, we've proved that we can think, that we can cogitate, that we can speculate, that we can do scholarly literature. Now how do we make this a living force, a breathing energy, an empowering source for people in the pews? I don't mind being corrected. I mean, but when you got Renita Weems and Kelly Brown Douglas, what you gonna say? I said, are you crazy? I said, no, I'm crazy.
Good evening. I'm
Good
so
evening.
glad to be here. Amen. My name is Reverend Sherry Cozy, and I'd like to come on the heels of my former instructor, Dr. Terrell. I'm ordained minister. I pastor a small non-denominational church. I'm a staff chaplain at University of Chicago Hospital, assigned to Comer. And my question, because I heard your story about Dr. Mays, not to put you on the spot, but for us who are on the front lines and who are trying to make a difference in our ministries, what is women's intuition? I've been wondering ever since you told the story. And how has that helped to fashion your model of what being a womanist is?
It's what Patrice Maldomis told me. If you've never read anything about this Burkina Faso scholar, healer, he says it's learning how to feel with your brain and think with your heart. What my grandmother would call Gumption. How to feel with your brain and think with your heart. And that if you ever met somebody who's so intelligent that you'd rather they didn't know anything because they're so callous and cold, don't have any kind of good bedside manners. I tell my seminarians all the time, you gotta know what you're called to do and what you're called not to do. If you go visit people in the hospital and they're sitting up and when you leave, they have to call a code and put them on the respirator. Leaving sick people alone. Leaving people alone, that's not what you call to go. There are people who work with children who hate children. People who work with senior citizens can't stand on people. Like when I was pastoring in New York, I knew I needed to get back to the academy. I love the preaching and the teaching, and I taught my Sunday schools every week. I did the confirmation classes. They said, Rev, the lights out. I said, why are you telling me? They said, Rev, we need to work on the budget. I said, can somebody do that? The funny thing was, I'm 25, I'm pastoring, right? And they said, are we going to have watch night service? I said, it's got to be at 7 o'clock because I got people coming to my house. They wanted to go to the party too, so they weren't coming to my party, they had their own party. So we had our watch night service at 7:30. So everybody was home by 10 so they could receive their guests. But see, when I was in seminary, women couldn't even do field education. I mean, where were we going to do field village, who would allow us in their churches to practice? So when my practice of ministry was actually after I got ordained, and I'm pastoring, and I'm doing all this stuff, and they called and they said one of my members' sons had OD'd and died from heroin, and I said, oh, how awful. I said, who's going to do the funeral? I've been preaching every Sunday. They said, you are Reverend Gannon. I said, no, this is serious. We need a real minister. I don't pay the funeral. You don't pay it. They said, we ain't help you, Rev. But that was the first thing after doing that funerals when I got my identity as their pastor. If I had field education, I would have known. They took that funeral, and he was 25, I was 25. So when you're doing a funeral with somebody your own age, it helps you grow up real fast.
Professor Cannon, thank you very much for being the stalwart person to carry on this stance of womanist theology within the context of the alleged post-racial society that we're living in. Would you please speak to why you think that it's necessary to have a hermeneutic lens of suspicion within the context of womanist theology?
I never thought that I would live in a society where, as my daddy would say, we're hustling backwards. That we're getting ready to disband affirmative action. That we got to do the voting rights every period. That people will be fighting not to provide Head Start, food stamps. I mean, it's just like, I thought we were going this way, and we just keep hustling backwards. And so, I mean, I'm praying harder than I've ever prayed. James Cleveland got me through my PhD. I don't feel no waste time. I wore that record out. There wasn't no CDs and DVDs. It was long. I know the people downstairs and next door just got tired of me and James Cleveland. Because there was 2 parts to it, and I just played it over and over and over. And that's where I learned to pray for myself, because before that I was borrowing my parents' prayers and my grandmother's prayers. Well, now I'm at a whole different, it's like, they say that Patti LaBelle can sing in the 7th octave. I'm praying at the 7th octave. For our people, for our nation, for our world. We in trouble, y'all. As Mahalia Jackson would say, if we ever needed the Lord, we sure did. So I believe prayer changes things. And I believe in prayer warriors. As a child growing up, right, when I reached 13, I was telling the students at lunch, I went to church so much, I said, if God, if you let me live out of these people's house, I'll never go to church again. Little did I know. My baby brother's also a pastor down in Charlotte, Jerry Cannon. And I don't pray. I'm not my family's pastor, you know. When we do Thanksgiving, I say, everybody at the table can pray. Even the children can pray. I say, if I pray, y'all gotta pay me.